Before anything else, do note that this video contains spoilers up to the impurity level. So, there are quite a few bosses in Library of Ruina, but not all of them are particularly created equally. So today, I'm going to rank them, and here to help me with that is ILiveNix.
Hello, my name is Aelith and I make guide videos for the Library of Ruina in League of Legends. I like to analyze gameplay and make guides to help people through the game. I hope you'll check me out, after this video of course. But right now, we're going to be giving our opinions on how fun and unique each boss's gameplay is.
For us, we define a boss as an enemy or a group of enemies that utilize the Shimmering passive, along with Kali and Olivier as they're both very boss-like enemies.
The rankings will be sorted by when you encounter each boss and split up into two parts. This video will be talking about all of the bosses before the ensemble receptions, and the next video will finish up the rest of the game. Let's get started.
I have not been quiet in praising Philip for both his design and story, but when it comes to this fight, it's alright. I really like the Feather Shield and Searing Sword mechanic where you're forced to play defensive or go all out. It's an interesting idea, but one that didn't quite work out here. The fight is just way too easy. I understand that they made it a bit less hard to triumph over as the Wedge of Fist comes right before it, and that's genuinely a decently difficult fight at this point in the game, but they definitely overdid it, making Philip fall a bit flat as he's really easy to unguard, even while in Feather Shield. I also really dislike the burn that he constantly applies. You're on a persistent timer forcing you to take unavoidable damage every turn. It doesn't feel fun. It even incentivizes you to rush him down if you're confident enough. But the main problem with this fight is just how darn quick it ends. If you have decent pages, he can stagger as early as in the first scene, and that usually means certain death for him in the second. If he just had stronger stagger, he would be so much higher, but he dies so quickly that he doesn't feel threatening or boss-like at all. But that's about everything negative I have to say about this fight. I like Philip's ego design, and the music is a nice listen as well. But that's kinda it.
The reception of Lovetown is held back by Tomerry's lack of HP. Initially, you couldn't attribute passives, and you didn't get as many bonuses for emotion levels, which made your damage lower. Now, it's quite possible to beat the reception while only experiencing one, or even neither, of the boss's interesting mechanics. Its first mechanic is in its combat pages. Would a square look nice? Charges Tomerry up for the next scene, which will decimate your librarians unless stopped. Unfortunately, it's very easy to do so as Tomerry's stagger resistances all change to fatal. The second mechanic is that when Tomerry falls below 50% HP, they'll transform and use special combat pages that are a lot stronger than normal. Again, very easy to skip this phase as it's only 150 HP, which can be easily taken out if Tomerry gets staggered. If their HP was increased up to 500 or even 600, their stagger resistance changed to weak instead of fatal during the square phase, or changed their damage resistance to normal across the board, then it'd be a much more intimidating and interesting fight. Gameplay aside though, this reception is a flavor and story win, easily one of the most memorable receptions in the entire game.
I wholeheartedly despise the circus. The strategy is to deplete Emma's stagger resist and unguard Noah. Emma has pretty ridiculous numbers, and Noah's range cards also hit pretty hard, but not to the point where it's excessive at this stage of the game. I like how the circus trope all have their specialties in the type of damage they do and the damage they take, but that's kind of it. Their buffs are straightforward and kind of boring. But the worst part of this fight is that music. The one that's playing right now. So annoying. But on the other hand, there's also Noah and Emma. I adore their designs and interactions, but that music is just too far gone.
The reception of the crying children is one that many players dislike, and for good reason. There are a total of 7 phases. The complete opposite of Tomerry in the first time you fight Philip, this boss simply takes way too long. And its mechanics, although interesting, aren't interesting enough to warrant this slog of a battle, especially since it's just 2 rehashed phases. The first phase type is against the unspeaking, unhearing, and unseeing children, who have different special effects that deactivate when they stagger. The best way that I've found to get through it is to focus down the unhearing child first to be able to clash properly, because on one of their combat pages, there's a hidden effect that reads, "On clash lose, resistances of all allies turn to fatal." The second phase is against the crying child itself. It has some decently powerful pages, but since it has few speed die, you can likely do this phase in 2 or 3 scenes. Then just repeat it 2 more times, then one last guy. I personally feel like if Project Moon cut out the 3rd, 6th, and 7th phases, that the reception would be much better overall.
Look, I do really like Argalia as a character, but this fight isn't exactly the best. The entire fight is actually pretty harsh, but there's a simple solution: attributing Puffy Broom to all your nuggets. Argalia actually does introduce quite a few new mechanics in his reception. His mass individual attack is one of the 2 in the game that has 4 dice. His power null is also something notable, and attempting to one-side Argalia is a little bit tough thanks to his defensive counter dice. However, he is still pretty easy to nuke. You only have to get him to 250 health and it's over. Just make sure that you're not making the really dumb mistake of bringing a firing squad like I did. If you're doing this fight straight out of Urban Nightmare, it's a bit of a pain, but if you already have a few Star of the City decks, you'll be fine.
The reception of the index proxies hits the right notes for me. The difficulty is close to what I'm looking for, just slightly too easy, and the index targeting mechanic is interesting. What really brings this fight together for me is the unlocked blade passives that the proxies have, which adds a ticking time bomb element to the reception. If you take too long, the fight will become much harder as the 3 proxies gain 1 power in their most powerful cards. Castigation reduces the power of the page it's clashing against and deals a bunch of bonus damage. Decapitation is hard to outroll and inflicts a slew of negative effects, and Eradication is a decently strong mass attack that can force bad dice placement. However, other than that, they just use regular cards, so it feels a bit less like a fight against a powerful boss, and more like a regular fight against a few strong enemies, which doesn't make it the most memorable or unique gameplay-wise. If the proxies had just a little bit more to the fight, maybe some sort of phase mechanic or more page modification, then it'd be much higher on the list. But as it stands, it's just a fairly good reception, and in a game with so many stellar ones, the proxies place fairly low on the list.
One of the 2 people on this list that don't use Shimmering, and yet she is able to spam cards the same way a Shimmering enemy would. Her cards and stats are really strong. Her roll rangers aren't half bad, but the amount of pages she plays per turn... If you let her trigger her card effects, it becomes a ceaseless assault of 0-cost pages on rushes and greater splits. You also have to consider the fact that she transforms at half health, gaining a large amount of power and greater split horizontal. Thankfully, you do get access to Bina's page for the fight, and she's basically built to counter Kali. Degraded Pillar and Lock are great examples of how she messes with Kali's tempo, but I do recommend at least doing one of Bina's abnormality fights before trying this strategy. I like Kali's design and the ego transformation, and her music is an absolute jammer. 10 out of 10 would get greater split vertical again.
Distorted Yan is a fairly unique fight. You aren't able to hit him initially and instead need to kill the 2 hands first. They have a slew of powerful pages, and Yan himself assists them by having pages that you need to redirect. Strength and Protect each target a hand and, as you'd expect, give strength or protection. The 3rd page he uses is Vigil, which nullifies power of the targeted librarian. It's important that you're aware of which librarian is getting targeted by Vigil, because some librarians like Gebra are more reliant on power boosting to win clashes. Yan also has a powerful mass attack, Distorted Blade, which has a countdown before using it, so at least you'll know when it's coming. After defeating the hands, he switches phases and uses a bunch of weak block dice. This is where you want to nuke him down. After a couple of scenes, he revives the hands at a lower HP and goes back to using the extremely strong evade dice. The main problem with this boss is that it takes a bit too long. The hands have a lot of HP and Yan doesn't take a whole lot of damage, so you end up needing to do 2 or 3 rotations to finish him off. Despite the interesting mechanics and distinct phases, unlike the Proxies, he just isn't hard enough for it to feel like the length is a real threat, just an inconvenience. Setting gameplay aside though, this story arc is definitely in the top 2 and the music is also top notch.
I wouldn't necessarily say that Iori is unfun or generic, but she's straightforward. Her difficulty comes from her really high rolls rather than anything else. That's why most people usually have polarizing views on her gameplay and difficulty. On one hand, you have some pages that just seem on paper broken, those that roll 2 digits without any trouble whatsoever. On the other, if you outroll her dice, you just win. There isn't any strategy to this fight at all. Her floor teleport passive is annoying, but it isn't really a game changer. It tries to make you build all of your floors, but it kinda fails to do so. You have 3 floors to beat her. 2 of them if you exclude the one that she teleports to. It's more a mild annoyance rather than anything that affects the fight. If you're able to consistently beat her ridiculous rolls, the fight's a win. And that shouldn't be too difficult if you manage to overcome the red mist.
Xiao is so close to the perfect reception. The difficulty is pretty much right where you want it to be, the mechanics are interesting and engaging, the fight isn't too long or too short, its acts and phases are very distinct, and the cards the enemy use are powerful and interesting to clash against. The only point where it falters is how its punish mechanic works and how that ties into the difficulty. Misuse of reverse scale can quickly turn the reception from an easy clear to a total wipe, which might feel a little too punishing, especially if you aren't paying attention with your hanging defensive dice or counter dice. Additionally, because messing up is so punishing, it had to be balanced by making the fight fairly easy when played optimally. However, fighting Xiao for the first time is a great experience, as you might play a bit slower and let her get access to her ego pages, which turn a slightly too easy fight into a race against the clock, and it adds a great elements to the fight near the end. As a side note, Xiao's special music, Iron Lotus, is an absolute banger, and her story is also stellar.
Olivier is a really fun fight. Whenever I have work to do and I'm looking to procrastinate, the first thing I do is launch up Hana Association 2. The fight is pretty straightforward, but can still be a little bit difficult. After all, the first time you do this fight, you're not allowed to use page attribution yet. So why is this fight so high up if it's simple? Well, as I said, it's fun and feels fair, other than Augury Kick. Olivier's fight is basically tailor-made for the Black Silencer's page, and while that might be a negative for some, personally I like it a lot more. The key to beating Olivier here is awareness. Sure, your base stats are actually higher than his in this fight, but you will fall behind on emotion coins and stagger resist if you're not paying attention. You need to be aware. Hana for all, the 4 trigrams and the Xiao fixers are fairly important parts of the fight. If you aren't paying attention, it's fairly easy to mess up. He doesn't really have any fancy tricks, and he doesn't really fight with underhanded tactics either other than Augury Kick. He doesn't have any mechanics, and he doesn't even have shimmering. But that doesn't mean that his fight can be beaten easily, unless you pick fervent beats. And that about covers it for this video. Do check out Alif's stuff, especially if you're into League or the more technical side of Library of Ruina. As a previous League addict, their videos are actually pretty interesting. But as usual, thanks for sticking around till the end, and make sure to visit again, yeah? And not just my channel this time. See you around.